Hello again and welcome back to another FMOD and Unity tutorial, where today we're going to be taking a sound in FMOD and we're going to look at how we can set up the FMOD event that plays the sound so that it changes from a 3D to a 2D sound during runtime of our game. Before we start, I just want to give you another quick reminder that the FMOD and Unity Essentials course is on its way again very shortly. Between the 3rd and the 7th of February, it will be available to you. Now, if you have any questions or just you want to learn a little bit more about this course, you can come to the website or a new little system that I've set up. If I scroll down to the bottom of this page, you'll be able to see that you can actually book a little consultation with me. So if you want, you can ask me a question directly over a video call. If you'd rather not, you can still email me the question or you can add it to the comment section of this video. But I thought this might be a cool thing to try out. If you don't have any questions or you just want some help quickly with FMOD or Unity, maybe you're stuck on something specific, again, feel free to book a little session with me and I'll be happy to talk you through it. This will be available until the 6th of February, by the way, so make sure you book yours up soon. So like I said, what we're doing today is we're taking an FMOD event and we're going to see how we can change it from a 3D event to a 2D event whilst the game's playing during runtime. Now, if you've ever played a Borderlands game, this is an effect you might be a bit familiar with. Whenever you're talking to an NPC in the game world, you can hear them talking, normally as you would expect, and if you rotate your player character, the sound of the person talking rotates with you. So if you rotate to the left, you'll hear the person talking in your right ear, and obviously if you rotate to the right, you'll hear them talking in your left, right? That's what you'd expect. However, if you walk far enough away from them to the point where you'd expect to not hear them speak anymore, you actually instead hear them kind of over a radio. And because you're listening to them over a radio that you have on your person, the audio is no longer three-dimensional, it's now two-dimensional, and there's not only has the distance attenuation of the volume gone, but also so has the direction orientation evaporated. Now it doesn't matter which way you face, you're always going to hear them normally. So that's what we're going to do today, and in case you've never played a Borderlands game in your life, I've got a quick little demonstration to show you.
I can safely report that Operation Trojan Claptrap was a complete success. I did it all by myself.
I'll bet. Well, the cult's destroyed every other Crimson Raider stronghold. Yeah, about that. Not the weirdest thing you're gonna see on Pandora. But seriously, thanks for answering my call. We might not have the numbers, but with a badass like you, we've got a fighting chance. Welcome to the Crimson Raiders.
Cool, so now we're all caught up. Let's have a look at how we can set that up in FMOD to play back in Unity. First thing we're going to do is take a look at an FMOD event I've created for this purpose. So what I've got is an event that just plays a load of random babbling and talking, nonsense really. What we're going to do is set this up so that we can switch it between a three-dimensional sound and a two-dimensional sound. First, let's have a quick listen to it normally, just so you know what the talking sounds like.
The bomber. Bomber?
Yeah, it sounds like utter nonsense, I know. So, like I said, the goal is to switch that between 3D and 2D audio. Now, with FMOD, normally when you create a 3D event, you get what's called an FMOD spatializer attached to the master track of the event. And this is what creates the distance attenuation and the orientation of the event when you're in the game. I'll quickly add one to this event. At the moment, because this event doesn't have one, it's technically a 2D event, but I'm going to explain in a little bit why it's not. But anyway, I'll quickly add one, so in case you haven't seen one before, you know what it looks like. So you've got a few options with the spatializer. You've got a distance attenuation graph and settings. So this is basically where you set how far the player has to be from the sound source for the volume to start to drop. The minimum number means, let's say if I set that to 5, if the player is between 0 and 5, that means they're going to hear the volume at its fullest. So basically imagine a point on this graph, it's at the top here. Then if they're anywhere between this bar here that you can adjust yourself, so in my case in between 5 and 20, they'll be somewhere on this graph and they'll start to hear the volume drop a bit. And then finally, if they go more than 20 units away from the sound, they won't hear anything else. And that all depends on the graph you select. There's a few different presets. For example, the one we're going to be using in a little bit, not on this spatializer, so I'm going to remove it, but we're going to be using this one, where even if the player exceeds that maximum limit of, in my case, 20, you can see the graph kind of doesn't go any lower than that. And so they're always going to be hearing the volume, even if they're, 100 meters away. It's just that it will be at, well, I don't know what that is exactly, -80. It kind of depends on, what you set your faders to. But, it'll get to a certain point and it won't go any lower. You also have some options to set the kind of sound size of the sound. So, for example, if you had, say, I don't know, the sound of a glass bottle dropping on the ground, the sound size of what you'd expect in real life isn't massive. You'd expect that to be a very directional sound. If someone dropped a glass bottle to my left, I'm going to hear it from the left. However, if someone pulled the pin out of a grenade to my left, not only would I be dead, but also the sound would sound like it's kind of engulfed me. I wouldn't hear it from the left. I'd kind of just hear it from all over. So by adjusting this sound size option, that's the kind of effect you can recreate. You can make things sound bigger. And until the player moves far enough away from the sound source, the sound will just sound like it's kind of everywhere. 2D essentially. There's no there's no direction orientation until you move far away enough. So that's the spatializer. What I'm going to do is quickly remove it from my master track because I want to have, like I said, we want the option to be able to switch it between 3D and 2D. And if we've got the spatializer on the master track, we don't have that option. It's always going to be three-dimensional. So we need to figure out a way of being able to overcome this little obstacle of ours. Now, the way I've done it is by creating two return tracks in my FMOD event, and I don't think we've talked about return tracks yet, so I'm going to quickly, talk about them now. So a return track is basically a track you can send the signal of one of your other tracks into before it reaches the master track. So I'm going to quickly, let me dig through some of these events. I'm going to try and find a traditional, that'll do here, this jump and land event I've created here. So traditionally, when you create tracks in an event, they're all going to be sent equally to this master track. So in this case, we've got 4 tracks all being sent to one master track where the signal is then combined. However, let's go back to talking to. With this event here, you can see I've got 2 return tracks. So what's going to happen here is, you don't have to send any signals to these return tracks, but obviously if you're adding them, you probably want to. What I'm going to do is I'm going to send this regular track. So starting with a regular track, I'm going to send that into both of the 2 return tracks, and then they're going to be sent into the final master track. I probably didn't prepare this lesson very well. I'm having to kind of show you in my fingers. In fact, I'll tell you what, let's open up these tracks a bit bigger. That might make things a bit more visually easy to understand. So starting here, this is where our signal's going to start. It's going to be sent to this one, the 2D radio track, which is, as you can see, is a return track, but it's also going to be sent to the 3D spatializer track, and I'm going to talk about those 2, what I've set them up to do in a bit. Then once them 2 have both got the signal inside them, they are then going to send their signal to the master track. Okay, so to create a return track, all you need to do is right-click one of your pre-existing tracks and select Add Return Track, and then you can see we get a little track called A. Then if we want to send a signal to it, we need to click either to the left or to the right of our fader, which will determine whether or not the signal is being sent before or after it hits our main volume fader on this track. Once you've done that, add your send. So go to Add Send, go to Event, and then select the return track you want to send the signal to. So I'm going to click A. And then you decide how much of the signal you want to send to it. Then if we click on A has its own fader, which is going to be sent to the master track. Now, I've already got some return tracks, as you can see here, so I'm going to quickly delete that. So like I said earlier, I've got a single track here, sending 2 identical signals to these 2 return tracks. Now, you might be thinking, doesn't that mean you're getting, multiple signals being sent to your master track? And doesn't that mean the listener's going to hear multiple copies of the same signal? Well, no, and this is where my little plan comes into play for switching between 2D and 3D. First of all, the send that's, or rather the fader that sends a signal directly from my character talking track to the master track, I've turned off 0. So that's never going to send a signal to the master track. We have to go through these 2 return tracks. And then what I'm going to do is send the signal to them both at the same time, but I'm going to create a parameter that automates them so that only one of the sends will be on or sending a signal at any given time. So as you can see, I've clicked on my character talking track and I've got 2 sends. Both I've put before my volume fader that goes to the master track. Not that, just so if there were, obviously because I don't want this to go to the master track, I have to turn that down. But if I put these sends after my volume fader, there wouldn't be any signal going into the sends to begin with, so they have to go before. And as you can see, one of them currently is at -infinity decibels, and the other is at, well, what should be, there you go, 0 decibels. Now the parameter that's going to control which send is going to receive a signal is this parameter up here, which I've called dimension switch. So as you can see at the moment it's set to 3, meaning that my return track called 3D spatializer, that's got a signal being sent to. However, if I drop it down to 2, you can see the 2 sends at the bottom there change. So now 3D spatializer is not getting a signal, but 2D radio is getting a signal. And that's how we're going to create our switch effect. If I then click on the dimension switch parameter sheet up here and click this little drop down arrow, you can see how I've automated the 2 sends. So what you do to automate a send is you do what you would to automate anything in FMOD. Right click on the dial and then you click add automation. I've already done it, so I've got the option to remove automation. And you get these lines that appear with some extra kind of drop down menus for each thing you've automated. And then you can decide by how much you want to automate everything. So as you can see, if my parameter is set to 2 and the cursor's on 2, we're going to hear the, the send is going to be sent to the 2D radio track at 0 decibels, but it's not going to be sent to the 3D spatializer track. Then as we increase it, the send to 2D is going to slowly drop. Once it passes 2.3, the send to the 3D spatializer is going to start to increase. And then eventually the 2D will be pulled down completely and 3D will be, the signal will be fully sent to that track. So later on, I'm going to show you how you can hook this parameter up to a script so that you can control that switching between the 2 tracks. But let's take a quick look at the tracks themselves now. So we've got the 2D radio track first. What I did is, I mean, you don't have to do this, but again, because we're kind of copying Borderlands a bit and we want it to sound like, we're not just hearing someone talk, even though there's no one around us, we're going to pretend that the player's got a radio on them and the sound is coming through a radio. So I've just added a quick multi-band EQ, done a bit of tweaking with it so it sounds a bit like a radio. So if I, if I set the dimension switch parameter to 2 and quickly play the sound for you. Sounds like it's coming through a radio. Also notice how you could hear, oh by the way, I should have mentioned, make sure you're wearing earphones for this so you might not be able to understand what we're talking about. Or just at the very least, hear the kind of demonstrations I give. So make sure you wear headphones. Yeah, so notice how there was no kind of directional information. You couldn't hear it in either your left or your right ear. You could hear them, it sounded like it was coming directly in front of you. Now in FMOD, we've got a little 3D preview option, which allows us to kind of set or kind of pretend where our sound source might be in our game world and then listen to it as if, we're in the game listening to it from that position. So if I put my sound to the right of my player and then play it again. Still sounds nice and centered, which is what we want because this is the 2D audio. However, now if I switch my parameter from, in fact, let's play it. What I'm going to do is play the track and then I'm going to gradually change the dimension switch parameter so you can hear the switch take place. There you go. So you should hopefully hear that in your right ear if you're, got your headphones in right. So now, of course, if we listen to the audio through the 3-dimensional track and I start moving around the sound source in our game, it's going to sound like it's coming from different directions. Cool. So if we click on our 3D spatializer return track, now you can see the spatializers appeared. What I've done here is, like I said, I've used that graph where, the distance will never completely drop out. And what I'm going to do in my game is basically I'm going to set up my script so that it's going to measure the distance between my listener or my player and my sound source. And whenever the distance is over 20 units or 20 meters, I think it will be measured in, then this parameter up here is going to switch from 3D to 2D, okay? So we don't really want, and as you can see, I've set the max distance of this graph to 20. Now, if I use one of these graphs where 20 would be minus infinity, nothing, we'd go from hearing the sound, then to not hearing it at all, and then suddenly it comes in through the radio. And you could do that, but to make it a bit more, the transition a bit more smooth, I'm using this one here so that, you know, it never completely drops out. Otherwise, when it comes back in, it might sound a bit too sudden, if that makes sense. And I think with that, that's pretty much everything to it. So yeah, you just have to set up the 2 tracks, send the track or the multiple tracks. If you've, you know, this isn't someone talking, you've made an event with different audio. Send all your tracks to both the 2 return tracks, and then use a parameter to automate which sends are going to be heard. And yeah, just stick a spatializer on one, and boom, you've got one track that plays 2D audio and one that plays 3D audio. So now that we know how to set up our FMOD event, I tell you what, let's give you a demonstration in Unity first, and then we'll look at the script I've wrote to get this all working. Okay, so this is the audio playing in 3 dimensions. So I'm just going to kind of walk around this scene, starting with, you know, I'll start close enough to the sound source so that it's 3-dimensional, and I'll make sure you can hear it in both the left and the right. But then what I'm going to do is move far enough away so we hear it in 2D. So let's have some fun. And I notice it doesn't matter which direction I'm facing, it all sounds centered. It's 3-dimensional again. So there you go. As you can hear, it's quite a nice and simple effect, and it's quite good because it means that you can communicate information to a player and still have it feel believable, like it exists in the real world, whether it's coming from a radio or from a specific location or person speaking, while still giving the player a bit of freedom to explore the environment they're in, which is why I really like this. So yeah, let's now have a look at the script that ties it all together. So it's this one here called audio dimension. Did I spell dimension wrong? I'm not sure. I might have done. Dimension? Oh god, I hope not. My spelling's never been great. Anyway, audio dimension switch that is attached to the object that is playing the sound. So in our case, it's someone talking, so I've attached it to this sphere representing someone speaking. And then obviously we've got a first-person controller, which is just the first-person controller that comes with the standard assets package that's in the asset store. Oh, I probably shouldn't have clicked on that. It's going to take ages to switch back. Oh no, there we go. So yeah, audio listener from FMOD is attached to this, not that. That's just. Oh, sorry. It's not attached to the first-person controller object. It's attached to the camera object. That is a child object of the main capsule that kind of moves around the scene. If we scroll down, you can see the studio listener component. So we know that this is a component that comes with FMOD when you integrate it into Unity, and it gives you a reference point for all 3D audio. Basically, this is going to act as the player's ears, and it's going to base all its 3D audio on the position of this component. So you know, it knows when it needs to start giving us the direction. Orientation changes. I'm losing my words, but you know what I'm saying. Cool. So yeah, so what we do is attach the script to the sound source itself. Then we need to select the audio we want to play. So I selected that talking event I just walked you through. And then we need to choose a max distance. So this is going to basically represent, this is basically going to be us choosing how far the player has to be from the sound source before it switches from 3D to 2D. Now, if we go back into our event quickly, we know that we left our min-max or our max distance for the attenuation curve at 20. So what I've done in Unity is I've just copied 20, nice and easy. Now, if you watch the occlusion video I did last week, we actually looked at a way of automatically using our script to find out, not that, to find out this number for it to do whatever with. Unfortunately, that only works if the spatializer component is located on the master track. if it's not, if the spatializer's on any other track, or it just straight up doesn't exist, then no matter what the max distance is set to, you're going to get the value of 0. So sadly, because of that, we do have to manually feed it. I've done it twice now, god damn it. We do have to manually feed it the max distance value, which is a bit of a pain, I know, but it's not too bad. You can just read the number and then stick it into the scripts. It's pretty easy. And we also know that this is something that will never change during runtime, so we don't have to worry about that either. But yeah, nice and easy to use. So let's edit the script and let's check it out. Now, before we go through it, as always, if you're interested in using this, learning from it, copying it, whatever, you'll find a link to my website where you can just copy this script as it is in all its glory straight into one of your projects, saving you having to kind of manually copy it from the screen. That's always a bit of a pain. But yeah, let's take a look at it. So starting off, we've got some variables to consider and look through. The first one is a string variable called select audio. Now this is just going to be just a collection of string data that's going to represent the name of our event that we want to play, which is talking to. Now I'm using the attribute FMOD unity.eventRef, and that's the magic spice that displays it, or rather it doesn't display it, but it gives us these options in Unity, if it's displayed through the inspector tab, to manually select which event we want to play. It saves us typing it in. What displays it in Unity is the serialized field. Alternatively, you can get rid of that and you can change the, I forgot what this is called, access modifier, I think that's what it's called, from private to public. But by making it private, it just means that no other scripts that you're using can access this variable, which is what we want. Next, we've got a variable of the event instance data type, which is an FMOD data type. This is what we're going to basically store a reference of our event into. Now, this script works per instance. So if you've got multiple, well, actually, now that I think about it, if you've got multiple people, if you're using this script multiple times, and you've got multiple people speaking at the same time, you want to make sure that, well, they can't speak at the same time, I suppose. Because if they are, then when you back away from all the people speaking, you're going to hear them all speaking to you in 2 dimensions, which is going to overlap and sound messy. Whereas if they're in 3D, at least then you can hear a kind of direction that they're coming from, which separates them a bit. Which, now that I think about it, in Borderlands, that's something that never happens. They make sure that this kind of effect is only used on the main character, and that there's only one main character speaking at a time. So that's how they kind of avoid that. Yeah, and now that I think about it, this script isn't set up to, on its own, fix that solution. So if you are going to use this script, just bear in mind that you need to make sure that there's only going to be one character or one sound being played through this script at once. But anyway, that variable basically allows us to reference or get an instance of any event we choose, which is going to be, as we mentioned earlier, the talking to event. Next, we have a variable called listener, which is of the studio listener type. This is going to store a reference to our game object, or our component rather, of the studio listener type. And once we've got a reference of that component and where it exists in our world, we can use that to kind of work out the distance between it and the sound. Next is another serialized field, which is going to appear in Unity for us to change. And it's the max distance variable. This time it's of the float data type, so it takes numbers. And as a default, I've set mine to 20. But again, you can change that in Unity if you wish. And then we've got a few more variables. One of the float type called distance. This is going to hold the distance between our player or our listener and the sound that we're checking for. It's going to constantly check the difference between them, and then we're going to compare that distance to the value set in max distance. So that's nice and easy. Then we've got 2 Boolean variables. Boolean means the variable can either be true or false. One's called distance less than max, and the other's called distance last frame. So distance less than max, when the distance value, or this variable here, when that's less than the max distance variable, that's going to be set to true. And if it's greater than the max, then it's going to be set to false. And just as a default, I'm going to set it to false to start off with. Then distance last frame, this is basically going to hold the same value as distance less than max, whatever value that may be. It's going to hold it. It's going to be the last thing we set in our script each frame. So then once the next frame starts, we have a reference to whatever value distance less than max was in our previous frame. So let's say during one frame that the player is 10 meters away from our sound, right? That means this is going to be set to true. and therefore so is this. That's going to be set to true. That's going to be the very last thing that happens on the frame. Then once the next frame turns over, let's say that the player's now magically teleported 100 meters away. Well, now obviously this is going to be set to false, and we want to, because later on we're going to want to check when the player makes that transition, that crossover between less than and more than the max distance. We're going to compare the value of distance less than max to distance last frame. So then in that example, where this is true, we can check to see if it matches distance last frame. And if it doesn't, which it won't, obviously, because one's true and one's still false from the previous frame, this one here, then we know to make that change. If they're both the same, then obviously there hasn't been a change between frames. So we don't want to say, start changing our parameter. Okay, but I'll explain that a bit more as we dive further into the script. Okay, so time to move on to the start function. Now we know that the start function is going to run on the very first frame of our game. So everything inside the function is going to happen once and only once, and that's at the start of our game, okay? First thing we want to do is store a reference to our studio listener component and store it inside that variable for us to interact with and use. And we're going to do that using the find object of type function. This function, pretty simple stuff. You feed it a component type, and it will search for a game object that has that component attached to it. Now, bear in mind, when using this, it's important to make sure that you've only ever got one copy of that component attached to something in your game. And because this is going to be for just a single player game with only one studio listener in it, well, we're only going to have one studio listener, so we know it's safe to use the find object of type function. So what you do, you feed the component you want to look for inside these triangle brackets like that. So that's what I've done. I've written fmod listener. The next thing we want to do is set up our sound to play, essentially. So what I've done is I've set the variable audio to create an instance of a specific event. That event is whatever event's going to be stored inside the select audio string variable, which we know is... Oh, I've lost it. Hold on. Bear with me. There we go. Which we know is the event talking event. So a single instance of that event is going to be created. Then on the next line, we want to basically place it in a specific position in our game world. And the way we do that is by using this function here, attach instance to game object. So this is basically going to find a game object and it's going to say, right, wherever this game object exists in our world, even after the first frame, you know, even if it moves, it doesn't matter. We want you to constantly play the audio, well, whilst it is playing, from that position. So what you do is, in the brackets, you give it the audio you want to play, or the event instance you want to play. Then you give it a transform component to attach to. Now, because we want this audio to play at the position of the game object that this script is attached to, we could just say, take the transform component, and then through that, it will find its position through the position coordinates on its own. And then the last thing it needs is to check if the object in question has a rigid body attached to it, because if it does, that means it could be affected by the physics engine, which could also move the game object and therefore the sound source. And even if it doesn't have a rigid body on, which mine doesn't, I believe you still need to check for it. So just write get component rigid body like I've done here. Cool, so we've got a instance of our event. We've attached it to an object. Now what we need to do is tell it to play, which is nice and easy, audio.start, and tell it to release, which means that when the object, or rather when the event stops playing, the event instance is going to be destroyed, which saves up memory and processing power and blah, 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 all that technical stuff. Now, in this case, my game or my talking event is going to continuously play and never stop. Obviously, that's probably not something you want to happen in your game. You might want to tell it to start and stop at specific times, and you can do that. It's just noting that in this case, this is what, well, not that first bit, this, mainly this, is what you'll have to change and place somewhere else, or, you know, maybe even in a different script, or in a different function perhaps, in order to, you know, get the person speaking timed right in a way you want. Okay, now we move on to the update function, which is the meat and potatoes of this script. So the update function we know is going to run multiple times. It's going to run once per frame, essentially. So if you've got if your game's running at 60 frames per second, this is going to run 60 times a second. Now the first thing we do is we want to take our distance variable and we want to give it a number. Specifically, we want to give it the distance between our sound and our listener. The way we do that is with the vector-free Let me highlight that better. There we go. The vector3.distance function. The distance function is nice and easy. All you do is you basically give it 2 coordinates and it will give you a distance between the two. So because we want a distance between our sound and our listener, the first coordinates I've given it is the transform.position coordinates of the game object that this script is attached to. So what that's going to do is it's going to find the game object is attached to, then it's going to take the positional coordinates, which are these numbers here, from the transform component. So that's our sound. Then to find our listener, we're going to take the listener variable that we stored a reference into earlier, and we're going to do the same thing, find its transform.position coordinates, and boom, we've got our 2 positions, then we can find the distance. And because obviously the distance can change, the player or the sound can move away from each other, that's why we need to run this in the update function and check it as many times as we can. So 60 times a second is what we're doing. Then once we've got our distance, we want to check it with our max distance number. So in an if statement, we're going to say if the distance is less than or equal to the max distance number, which is 20, then we want to set the distance less than max variable to true, because the distance is less than the max number. Then we write an else if statement directly underneath that and say, okay, well, if it's not, and if the distance is then greater than max distance, then we know that it's obviously not less than the max distance, so we want to set that to false. So now every 60 times a second, we can now check the distance less than max variable to see if we're within that range of our sound. Well, now that we've got that stored inside a variable, we want to check that variable to see if it's worth us changing our parameter to change it from 2D to 3D. Now, we don't want to make a check here. Whilst with these if statements here, these are, like we said, running 60 times a second. So this variable is going to be set to true 60 times a second. The code is essentially going true, 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 like that. But that's not something we want to do when setting our parameter, if we can avoid it. If we go back to FMOD, we don't want this to keep saying 60 times a second, set this to 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, now 2, 2, 2, 2, 2. It's a little bit unnecessary. So we're going to make a quick check to prevent this from happening. What we're going to do is look for the moment when I mentioned this earlier, but we're going to look for the moment when the distance less than max variable switched from false to true or true to false. So we say if the distance less than max variable doesn't equal the same value as the distance last frame variable, which, remember what I explained earlier, that's going to tell us whether or not the distance was less than or greater than the max distance during the previous frame. So if they're different, if they don't equal the same thing, then we know a change has been made, and therefore we can trigger our parameter. So we check to see if a change has been made, and then we want to check to see if distance less than max is true. Because if it's true, then we want to specifically trigger, well, I'm going to get onto that in a bit, but what we're going to do is specifically tell our parameter to switch from 2 to 3. Now, I've just remembered, let me quickly go back to my parameter. It's quite important that, whilst you don't have to do this, what I've done is I've set the range of my parameter from 2 to 3. And the reason why is simply so that it's a bit visually easier to see whether or not I'm switching from 2D to 3D. You know, so if the parameter is set to 2, I know that's 2D. If it's set to 3, I know it's 3D, as opposed to like 0 or 1, where it can get a little bit confusing. Anyway, so back to our script. At the bottom here, I've got another function called dimension switch. And as you can see here, inside it, it's going to take our audio. It's going to use the set parameter by name function. Then we're going to feed it our parameter name that we want to change, which is dimension switch. And then we want to give it a number. So we're going to give it either the number 2 if we want to switch it to 2D, or 3 if we want to switch it to 3D. So if the distance less than max variable has changed from what it was in the last frame and doesn't equal the same thing, if it's gone from true to false or false to true, then we want to check to see if it is true or false. And if it's true, which means that the player is close enough to the sound, it's within that range of 0 to 20. If it's true, then we want to make sure our sound is 3D. So what we're going to do is call that function to trigger the dimension switch function. We're going to call that to trigger and change our parameter, and we're going to give it the number 3. So what it's going to do is going to take this number 3, it's going to pass it into this variable here, which has been declared inside the parameter brackets of this function. And then this variable is then being fed into our set parameter by name function. So it's going to call this function. It's going to then feed the number 3 into this variable. That variable is then going to feed that number into our dimension switch parameter, which in FMOD is going to change from 2 to 3, thus changing our sound from a 2D sound to a 3D sound. And as we know, that's going to obviously change the signal due to our automation of the sends. Or rather, it's not going to change the signal, it's simply going to turn the send that we created down on the 3D track, and it's going to up the send on the 2D track, thus we hear it without the spatializer. Boom, we've got a 2D sound. So we make that check using an if statement. We check to see in one foul swoop, we check to see if the distance less than max variable has changed compared to the last frame, and if it's set to true. And if it is, we set our sound to 3 dimensions. However, we also need an else if statement if this condition isn't true. We say, okay, well, if the distance less than max variable has changed compared to the last frame, but this time it's false and not true, represented by the exclamation mark in front of the variable's name, then trigger the parameter again, but this time don't feed it the number 3, feed it the number 2, which as we know is going to do the exact opposite. So it's going to send the number 2 all the way into FMOD, and it's going to switch it from the number 3 to the number 2. Now at the moment, obviously thanks to this collection of if and else if statements up here, we're setting a value for the distance less than max variable every frame. However, we need to set a value for the distance last frame variable, which at the moment is, as far as the script is aware, still false and is always going to stay false. And like I said earlier, this is something we want to make sure happens at the very end of our script, the last thing that happens. So then it represents, so then once the new frame ticks over, we can use that value in our new frame. So that's why at the very end of our update function, the last thing I do is I set the value of the distance last frame variable to match whatever distance less than max currently is. As soon as that happens, bang, new frame, and distance less than max gets a new value, whilst distance last frame remains whatever it was in the previous frame. The last thing to talk about is a little optional thing. I've just added a little debug.log function, which is going to display a message in the console tab of Unity to basically tell us if this script works properly. You may have noticed when I was giving that demonstration that these little messages were appearing. Well, if you read them, it says switching event talking to, which is the name of our event, from 2D to 3D. And again, if it goes the other way around, it will say switching it to 2D. Now, you don't have to have this. You can delete this line if you want, but like I said, just for checking it worked, this was nice and handy to have. And with that, we're all done. So that is how you can change your events from sounding 3-dimensional to 2-dimensional during runtime of your game. So I hope you enjoyed that. I certainly did. And yeah, I kind of came up with this idea the other day once I finished playing Borderlands 3. Now I need a new game to play, so I think that's what I'm going to shoot off and do now. Thanks very much for watching. Let me know if you have any questions on this, if you got stuck at all, or if I can help you a bit more. Drop me a message in the comments below. Like I said, you can go to scottsgamesounds.com to copy that script and use it in your own projects. And if you're interested, feel free to get in touch with me about the FMOD and Unity Essentials course, a course designed to give you all the essentials, tools and techniques you need to use FMOD and all its glory inside Unity. And of course, if you want, you can get in contact with me and we can have a little talk via video call. So I've been Henry Scott. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.